I'm trying to imagine you, Gordon, as a 21-year-old student charging around with a Clockwork Orange. I mean, did you always have this sense that, a sort of sense of drive and a kind of desire to get into these sorts of arguments?
I think Clockwork Orange just came a bit later. I think I was a postgraduate then, and I then became a lecturer, and then I became a politician. You know, I enjoyed teaching at a university, and I would have been quite happy to continue teaching. But there were issues in my hometown, poverty, unemployment. There were issues I just wanted to do something about, and so that's what drove me into politics. But I enjoyed teaching, and probably maybe I should have stayed as a teacher.
Well, actually, it links to a question from Teresa Taylor, who's one of our grads here, who wonders, and she's actually a politics student, but she's wondering, did a study of history help you become a politician? Did it help you when you were in leadership positions?
I think so, but you know, it's back to what I was saying. You've got to see the bigger picture in everything you do. There is a real danger because we're all becoming specialists. And education is about specialization to a large extent. We're encouraged to specialize in a whole series of different disciplines. I think you're writing about this, Tom, about the general purpose of education is to develop the whole personality and character and to be based on values. And I think you and I were involved in a project that you actually initiated in Lebanon, where you introduced as the ambassador into the curriculum of the schools, interreligious teaching, so that people could understand each other's religions. I think history helps you get the bigger picture. I think other subjects are also capable of doing that in the humanities. And I think there's always a danger that we become too specialist and we retreat as economics did. And I don't know how many of the people on this are looking at economics as a subject, but economics tended to retreat into mathematical economics and lost sight of what Adam Smith called political economy, which is the study not just of the mechanics, but the study of the purposes of economic activity.
So I want to get back into some of the substance of how we change the world. But first, actually, another leadership question, actually, from Caleb, one of the students, who says, have you got any advice for Gareth Southgate?
No, I think he should be giving us advice as politicians or as past politicians. I think he has done brilliantly. You know, I'm a supporter of Scotland, and whatever happens, we will pride ourselves in the fact that England did not beat us in this match, and it's beaten every other team. But I wish him well. But I think what he's done is capture the spirit of the country as a multiracial, diverse country where people actually value each other. I mean, after all, this English team has many people who have roots in Asian communities and Afro-Caribbean communities in Africa itself, and many players that could have played for Ireland actually because their parents were either Irish or their grandparents were Irish. So it is a multiracial team, multi-ethnic, and I think he's capturing the spirit of an inclusive Englishness, and I think he's really he's seen as a leader of the country now in so many different ways. And I think he's making people believe it is possible for us all to work together. It's possible for us to cooperate, and it's possible for us to see the virtues in different aspects of our national character. So I don't want to comment on his choice of players. Other people are better at doing that than I am, although I follow his choices very closely. But I think he has captured the spirit of the country in a way that perhaps no other manager has done in recent times.
So is football coming home? Can you give us a scoop on whether you think that will?
Look, I think England's done pretty well. I think, look, if they can draw with Scotland, they must be quite good.
Right, let's get back to.
I've been a supporter of the Scotland football team for years, and I just have to tell you, my first memories. It really does matter to national identity what's happening to your football team, because my first memory is 1961, believe it or not. I'm sorry to say so. And the match wasn't even on television, it was on radio, and it was Scotland playing England in 1961 at Wembley, and the score was England 9. This is football, 9, Scotland 3. And things were so bad, it was a humiliation for Scotland. The goalkeeper had let in 9 goals, that the goalkeeper, after a few months, he had to emigrate to Australia because things were so difficult. And even 30 years later, when he met people in Australia, his first question to people coming from Scotland was, is it safe to come back? And of course it wasn't. And so football is really the repository of national dreams. and ambitions and aspirations. And for me, as a young kid growing up at the age of 8 or 9, to find that Scotland had actually lost 9-3 was a terrible thing to wake up to. And listening to it on the radio and all the goals going, there were players who played in that match who denied that they were in the team, even when they had scored a goal, one of the 3 goals. They always gave the impression they were never in that team. So football is a very important carrier of dreams.
Yeah, it's not often Scotland scores 3 goals in a match. But anyway, now, so,
at rugby, yes, we do when we beat England.
I asked the students of the 7 challenges that you identify, the 7 changes that we can make, which are the ones that most resonate with them? And they went, it may not surprise you, they went for climate, poverty, and education. So let's maybe dig into those a bit. On climate, you know, I was with you at the Copenhagen summit in 2009. Great failure of a summit. You know, I remember one subsequent prime minister saying, you know, people talk about it like Vietnam. They sort of say, you know, you weren't there, you can't understand how horrific it was. But at that summit, you and many other leaders stood up and said, unless we act now, it's too late. So is it not already too late?
It's almost too late. I mean, I don't think the decisions we've made since then, like Paris in 2015, or what's being proposed for the COP26 in Glasgow, are themselves going to do enough to halt the progress of, if you like, climate disaster. So we've got to do more. But if you go back to 2009, when we were there together at this summit, what's really interesting about climate change decisions is this is not like a G7, the 7 richest countries. You've got 194 countries all at this meeting. It's effectively one person, one vote. And I remember when we arrived, I think you'll remember too, that one delegate was challenging the right of the Danish, because it was in Copenhagen, even though they were hosting it and paying for it, they're challenging the right of them to chair the conference. So it was absolutely chaotic and anarchic. And so every leader was going up and giving his speech, but there was no method of making a decision. There was no chance of getting an agreement if you had to get 194 people around a table. So we formed a small executive, but that descended into chaos as well. And there was a huge, there was almost a fight between some of the delegates because people were feeling that you know, they couldn't solve the problems and they were insulting each other. So it broke down in chaos. We didn't get the agreement we wanted. We thought that after the success of the G20 on the economy, people would be prepared to work together. But to be honest, China was not ready for an agreement. India was not ready. America was not ready. Only the Europeans were ready, actually, for the sort of agreement that we need. Now, I think when it comes to COP26, there's a greater willingness, China, India, America, to work with Europe to get an agreement. The question is, are we ambitious enough? Because we've got to set, you know, under the system, countries set their own targets. There's an agreement about what needs to be done universally, but there is no obligation on a country to take a particular form of action in terms of the target they've got, only to publicize it and to make it be properly known and understood. So we've got to get countries to be more ambitious. I think companies have got to now all agree, and if they don't, by law, they should be forced to agree to disclose their carbon footprints. We need to know what the carbon footprints of all these companies are, and they need to have mission statements for getting rid of carbon in their portfolios. And then we've got to help the poorer countries because they cannot adapt and mitigate unless they get special help to do so. And we promised in 2009 $100 billion to help them. We haven't raised that in the last 11 years. They're 12 years now. And we are promising 100 billion a year from now on, and there's no chance of reaching that unless the richest countries make a decision to help the poorest countries. So we've got a lot of decisions to make, but there is a chance of progress because people realize the need for progress, but are they ambitious enough? Not yet. We've got to make them more ambitious. And that's where young people's action comes in, because there's no doubt that the climate change movements have forced change. If it hadn't been for popular pressure, I don't think many governments would have acted. I don't think many companies would be rushing to declare their carbon commitments or anti-carbon commitments. So popular pressure is necessary. So any of you who are listening, who are involved in some of the different movements for action on climate change, I would encourage you to intensify your efforts and focus on what can be achieved at COP26, which is the Glasgow conference, and how you can influence that by pressurizing your members of parliament or your governments to do something that is bolder than what they're planning at the moment.
It's actually a very relevant question, thank Gordon, from Alex Clark, who's one of our geographers here, actually working on the front lines of this effort and also leading the charge on getting Hertford to net zero by 2030. It's a political question. It's about the Labour Party, I'm afraid. How does the Labour Party tread a more convincing line between the economic neoliberalism that we're seeing and a sort of what he described as a more superficial brand of socialism? So on climate change, how do you get an issue like that to resonate with the voters? And how can Labour be socially just and economically effective on climate action?
Well, that's right. That's right. You know, when I started in politics, and I was the shadow finance minister for a long time, you know, we thought of economic policy as economic progress and social justice, the two sort of parts of an economic policy. You can't discuss economic policy now without talking about environmental stewardship as part of a trinity of economic objectives. And how you reconcile them is the question, as Alec that has put to us and has asked us to consider. Look, when we did what was called the Stern Report about the beginning of the century, and we published what was the first detailed study of what we had to do to meet climate change targets, we said, you know, the long term has got to be taken into account, and you must take long-term actions in preference to just doing things in the short term. So we were asking people, if you like, to trade off the present for the future. Now I think it's even clearer, and that's why it's a simpler message. And it's basically, this is the opportunity, because if we can invest in renewables, if we can invest in nature itself, if we can invest in the sort of planting trees and everything else, if we can do all these things, then we're not only creating a cleaner environment, we're actually creating jobs, and we're creating a better economic future. So the two things now go together: environmental improvement and economic progress. I don't think we should be talking about one at the expense of the other, or a long-term objective that has got to be met at the expense of a short-term. I think we should be talking about how there is a huge opportunity before the world now, and it makes sense for this recovery, particularly for building back better, that we concentrate on jobs in renewables, energy efficiency, jobs in improving our nature and soil and the whole land and seas and everything else. All these things are part, I think, of an economic policy that makes sense in coming out of the COVID. And so I think people have got to be more radical, and I think that's what both environment and economic logic is now telling us.
I think I can hear from here the students cheering along to that, and indeed many of our professors as well. Let's get into poverty, Gordon. All the challenges you've discussed seem to rely on some form of enhanced international coordination and cooperation. And yet, all the evidence from your time and since is that these systems are bust. Are they really fixable, or do we have to just start again now?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some advances. The ozone layer we dealt with on the environment, and that was a big advance. On debt relief for Africa at the beginning of the century, there's been a major reduction in absolute poverty, not the same progress in relative poverty, but absolute poverty is reduced. But it's again rising, and it's rising because of COVID, and it's rising because we have actually not done enough to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, look at this problem. There are 80 million people who are displaced in the world. There are 25 million refugees. How can you honor the promise that you will rid people of absolute poverty unless you can deal with some of the problems facing refugees and displaced people? And we're not doing it. I mean, I tell the story in the book of a tragic event in Italy, in Greece, Moria, the refugee camp 2 years ago. It's more than 2 years ago now, when three teenagers who'd been in this camp, not getting any help whatsoever. They were just really imprisoned in this camp. They were displaced kids in their teens, attempted suicide. I mean, this 12, 13, 14, when everything should be in front of you. These kids were driven because hope dies when a convoy's lost at sea, or a food can't get through to a besieged town, or when there's no doctors, when in a hospital where people are suffering from a disease that could be cured if we had the right medicines and the right staffing. But hope also dies when kids don't have opportunity, and our humanitarian system is bust. Not because we haven't got great people who are running humanitarian agencies and humanitarian charities, but because we cannot raise the money to pay for the humanitarian aid that is needed. This year, an appeal has gone out, I think, for 35 billion. We may raise half of that, 17 billion. That means we'll raise the equivalent of about $4 a week for every displaced person in the world. $3 or $4 a week. How can that feed, clothe, shelter, educate, give healthcare? $4 a week for the poorest people in the world who are under displacement or are themselves refugees. Now, we've got to have a better system. Now, I propose in the book that we've got to find a way of getting the World Bank, which could raise the money, but doesn't have the direct remit for humanitarian aid, to work with the United Nations that has the direct remit for humanitarian aid, but doesn't have the money. We've got to find a way of getting those with the resources to help those that don't have the resources, but have the responsibility to do so. We've got to make the global system work better. And I hope that when people look at these issues, they don't hold up their hands in horror, say nothing can be done. What they say is, look, there are practical changes we can actually make if we get together. And this will require public pressure, you know, on behalf of refugees, on behalf of displaced people, but also on behalf of the world's poor, who are located mainly now in Africa and increasingly now in Africa. We've got to do something to alert the world that you cannot have a civilized world. You're not going to be able to deal with terrorism and all these other issues unless we can deal with some of the fundamental problems that these continents and countries face, which of course comes back to conflict, but also comes back to poverty and the lack of economic justice.
So KP in the chat actually comes back then to your question of hope. So in the midst of all that, you know, despair, I mean, what would you say, KP asks, and I don't think it's the cricketer, but what would you say to a pessimist to convince them that the world is still worth fighting for?
It's funny because after the Second World War, 1945-46, and the devastation, and you could say that man was at absolutely zero, and we were dealing with a world that had fallen apart. There was this great meeting between Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, Camus, Albert Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, André Malraux, Arthur Koestler, and they all met in Paris. And Camus, whose books were actually the books of an existentialist writer, he said to them all, and he said, didn't we get it all wrong, he said. That's existentialism. Didn't we get it all wrong when we said there were no such thing as moral values? And if we were to admit we were wrong, this is what he was saying to them, would that not be the beginning of hope? And I think hope is such an important characteristic. You know, I've quoted before Martin Luther King and the great speech he made in the mid-1960s, fighting for American civil rights. And Martin Luther King had prepared a speech for this Washington demonstration, massed people there listening to what he had to say. And he prepared a speech that was technically very good about the case for civil rights and everything else, but it wasn't taking off. He wasn't making any impact on the audience. This was Martin Luther King, even then one of the greatest orators, but he was making no impact on his audience. When one of his people with him, who was a singer, Martin Jackson, she shouted at Martin and said, Martin, tell them about the dream. Tell them about the dream. And suddenly Martin reverted to a speech he'd been using previously about, you know, the dream, you know, and it was about, you know, I dream of a country where people walk hand in hand, children of all colors and everything else. I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. And suddenly it took off. Suddenly this became this sort of the biggest case ever put, I think, in America, and reported as so for civil rights, but because he was sending a message of hope. I have a dream of the world that we can create. And I think it's really important that when we're talking about these issues, whether it's poverty or education, or whether it's talking about what we do about vaccinations, or even about the climate change, that we don't reduce these simply to technical issues. We've got to have a mastery of detail. You need a mastery of detail. You need to know the questions that are being thrown at you if you're a politician or answering for a case that you've got, but you've got to give people a vision of what's possible. And Martin Luther King did that when he said that he had this dream, and it captivated people and has done so ever since. And that's why, you know, Camus was right. The beginning of hope is actually setting out your case in a way that you encourage people that it really is a big picture that you're presenting of a world that can change.